last speaker of today's first session is Catherine Paquette. And Catherine is with WWF Canada, and she works as part of the restoration and regeneration team. And I don't know if we met formally yet, Catherine, but I've heard your name often spoken at the Institute to know the great work you're doing with the Watershed reports, which are this great synthesis of the health and threats of facing Canada's watersheds across the country in a very standardized and very approachable way. So I believe today you're going to be talking about those reports and your work in leading some of the reassessments of those reports in 2020. So thank you and welcome. Happy to have you join us. I'm just going to share your presentation here. And
awesome. Thanks for having me, Matt.
You're welcome.
Perfect. Let me just see. All right. So hi, everyone. Happy to be here, and I want to thank the St. Lawrence River Institute for putting on this really great event. So like Matt said, I'm Catherine Paquette, a freshwater specialist with WWF Canada, based in Ottawa. And today I'll be talking about our watershed reports, and specifically, sort of like Matt alluded to, the results of our 2020 reassessment that we published just last week. So this is brand new stuff. In WWF Canada, sorry, just want to make sure I'm on the right slide. All right. Perfect. All right, so WWF Canada, along with many organizations, we have this shared goal or shared vision, and that's to see all waters in Canada in good condition. And at the end of the day, that's all we're working towards, right? We want to see these healthy waters. But how do you measure healthy waters? How do you know when you're there? And how do we do that in a nationally standardized way? So this is really where Watershed Reports comes in. We've created a methodology with the help of a group of scientific advisors from academia and government to really assess the health of and threats to Canada's freshwater. And with the idea that once this is established, we'll be able to say where things are good, where they're not so good, and where do we just need a little bit more information. So this is really why we began this project. We realized that there was a need for a greater understanding of our country's greatest resource. And this research is based on a twinned assessment. So there's a health assessment, and that's really looking at the existing health of watersheds. So, how are they doing right now? And then there's a threats assessment. So looking at what are those major stressors on our freshwater ecosystems. So here are the 4 health indicators that we look at. So I'll briefly touch on them, but if you want any sort of more in-depth information on the metrics that we use and all of that, please do reach out. So we look at water quality, and this really looks at the proportion of measurements of a given parameter. So for example, aluminum, and how many times does that exceed the guidelines for healthy aquatic life? So how often are measurements exceeding those guidelines? If it's only a few times, well, maybe that's good or very good. If it's a lot of the time, well, now we're into that poor and very poor territory. Our hydrology metric or water flow metric looks at trends over time. So it's a composite of annual, monthly, long-term, and short-term trends. And when possible, we'll include a pre-dam versus post-dam analysis. Or if that's not possible, we'll do a historic versus recent analysis. So we're really looking to see, are things changing over time? Our fish metric looks at the presence and absence of native species over time. So again, just looking, are there changes over time? And for a benthic invertebrate indicator, so those are those little creepy crawlies, the bugs that live at the bottom of the river. We use a family level Hilsenhoff biotic index. And basically this just looks at the families in a given sample. And depending on what's there and what's not there, and on the tolerance level of some of those families, we can attribute a score. So we get data from all over for these indicators, all levels of government, other ENGOs, conservation authorities, community-based monitoring groups, academia. We're really not picky. We'll take any sort of data that we can get. And once we run these analyses, we'll attribute a public-friendly score. So our scores range from very good to very poor, and they're color-coded, so they're easy to understand. And then each of these indicators will get a score, and we'll roll it up to give a score for the entire watershed. We also attribute a data sufficiency score. And so this is just based on the availability of data, both temporally and spatially. And it's just to ensure that we don't use a small number of points to infer a score for an entire basin. We do want the results to be representative, or as representative as possible. And we continually update them as needed. So I just mentioned our 2020 relaunch. So here are the results of our 2020 reassessment. So these are our overall health scores. So I'll remind you, these are an average of the scores of those 4 indicators I just touched on. And I'll dive into some of the indicator results in the coming slides. So what strikes me first when I look at this map is that data deficiency is still an issue like it was in 2017. We see a lot of gray on this map. And some progress has been made. So now we see 100 of those 167 subwatersheds are data deficient. In 2017, it was 110 are data deficient, so it's a little bit of progress. The majority of the country is still data deficient. There are some good news stories, though. Where we do have enough data, scores are usually good or good or very good. So that's great to see. Other good news stories are that in areas like the Great Lakes and the Ottawa watersheds, they used to be data deficient, but now we have enough data to attribute scores. Unfortunately, those scores are less than good. In the last 3 years, so since our 2017 launch, we have noticed a movement towards open data. So having those large databases be open with data that's easily downloadable makes our assessment process significantly easier and less time consuming. There's still lots of concerns though. The Southern Prairies, for example, it's home to a lot of agriculture. It's really data deficient. And there are areas where, the scores are not ideal. And so those are also concerning. And basically what it tells me is that more work needs to be done. So here I have a snapshot of our website, which I invite you to check out. And it zooms in on the St. Lawrence Basin. And again, this is the overall health. So that average of those 4 indicators that we see listed on the right. And I'll focus on the St. Lawrence for obvious reasons. And at this scale, so the St. Lawrence watershed covers the area from Kingston to the Saguenay. And it's made up of 5 subwatersheds. So these are still very large units. Because this is a national assessment, we operate at a broader scale. And so that's just something to keep in mind. So we have the upper St. Lawrence, which is in red in this map, and that indicates a very poor overall score. And that's the part sort of where St. Lawrence River Institute is by Cornwall. And then we have the central St. Lawrence, which we see in that yellow color in the middle. So it includes an area from the islands of Montreal to Trois-Rivières, and that gets a fair overall score. We have the Saint Maurice watershed, which is in that darker blue, showing very good scores. We have the lower St. Lawrence in the paler blue, showing a good score overall. And then there's the main stem of the St. Lawrence. So a little harder to see here, but it's fair overall as well. And that's its own subwatershed. And on the right of the slide, so you see those different indicator scores for the whole watershed. So overall, it received a score of fair, with poor score for flow, good score for fish, fair score for benthic inverts, and it's data deficient, unfortunately, for water quality. We can dive into individual indicators. So here we see hydrology or flow. And this is definitely a concern for this particular watershed, with scores being, less than ideal, mostly the fair and poor scores. What stands out is that the main stem of the St. Lawrence is ranked as good. This is a bit of a tricky one because the way that we assess water flow is that we look for changes in time and assume that changes are bad, and if there are no changes, it's good. The St. Lawrence is very regulated, and so dams are doing their job and are sort of saying that year over year, you don't see the changes as much as you might see in smaller tributaries. It's also tricky because parts of the St. Lawrence are lakes and they act differently, and our indicators really based on rivers. So it's a little bit of a tricky one for us to assess. Moving on to water quality. So water quality is data deficient in large parts of the watershed. And this isn't because of lack of monitoring or even lack of access to data. It's really because the government of Quebec has created its own indicator to assess water health, and it only requires a few parameters for them to be able to get a score, which means that when we access their data, there aren't that many parameters that we can consider. And our methodology requires at least 10% of samples have 10 parameters or more for us to reach that minimum data sufficiency. So it's a little bit unfortunate that sort of what they're doing and what we're doing doesn't necessarily jive. But in other parts of the watershed, we do have scores. So the upper portion of the watershed, as well as the main stem, receives a score of fair, and the Saint-Maurice receives a score of very good. This indicator allows us to also dig in a little bit deeper, and we can look at those individual parameters. And so parameters that are of concern for us in this watershed include metals like zinc, uranium, copper, lead, mercury, aluminum, nutrients like phosphorus, and some physical parameters like turbidity. So when I say that they're of concern, I mean that they're often exceeding those guidelines for healthy aquatic life. And so for us, those are just something to keep an eye on and something to keep in mind. And now we can move on to benthic invertebrates. So it's the last health indicator I'll touch on. A few things that stand out to me are we see a lot of less than ideal scores. So the upper St. Lawrence is very poor. The central is fair. The main stem of the St. Lawrence is poor. And this is really, it's worrying. And it's definitely contributing to those overall scores that we're seeing that are not so great in much of these subwatersheds. I'll quickly touch on the threat indicator. So we did reassess these just because we feel like the threats are more consistent over time. They're not going to change all that much in a few years. So these assessments date back to our previous assessment in 2017. And for a threat assessment, we look at these 7 key threats. So again, if you want any more detail on how we actually analyze these 7 threats, please reach out and I can share a methodology. But we look at pollution, habitat loss, overuse of water, habitat fragmentation, alteration to flows, invasive species, and climate change. And similarly to the health assessment, so we score them each individually, then we can roll up to an overall threat score. And in this case, they range from a very high threat to very low threat. So here are the overall threat scores for the whole country. And when you look at this sort of at first glance, you really see a strong north-south gradient. You notice that the more northern latitudes have significantly lower threat scores than the southern latitudes along the American border. And that's, sort of expected. That's where most of our population lives, our industry, our agriculture. But we can dive into the individual threats, and that's where we see a lot more diversity across the country. So I won't dive into all of them, but I will focus on the St. Lawrence again. So St. Lawrence is obviously a highly threatened system. Again, expected maybe because of our high population and agriculture and industry. But major threats in this system include pollution, habitat fragmentation, and habitat loss. So it might be a little hard to see, but on the right of the screen, you see the different subwatersheds, and each of these little icons represents one of those 7 threats. So I do invite you to actually check out our website, so watershedreports.wwf.ca. We have a really cool interactive map. You can zoom into your area, go through the different health indicators, threat indicators. There's some reports on there. And so just, get a little bit more familiar with the results in watersheds that are of interest to you. And I also invite you to check out our new report, which was just published last week. So quickly to wrap up, in our report, we do include recommendations, and the recommendations are really similar to the ones that we had in 2017, because honestly, things just haven't changed all that much. Our recommendations are they're geared towards the broader freshwater community, but some are for governments. They include the need to expand monitoring to cover more of Canada's diverse landscapes. They call for more standardization of monitoring and data management, which would make assessments like ours easier. The lack of consistency in how we monitor and how we manage data is really a barrier. And those issues haven't been resolved yet in just a few years. We also stress the need for consistent reassessments. So we recognize that assessments like our own are really only a snapshot in time and can quickly become outdated. So with the release of watershed reports just last week, we're acting on our own recommendations. And where WWF plays a major role is really in elevating community-based water monitoring or citizen science. So we're delivering again on some of those recommendations. We said that community-based water monitoring needs to be more elevated and needs to have a more prominent place in health assessments and general freshwater discussions, and we're really acting on that. So quickly, some next steps. I won't dive into all of these. I think I'm sort of running out of time, but I do invite you to check out the WWF.ca website. We have lots of programs that are great opportunities for individuals, for organizations to make a difference, from benthic monitoring programs like STREAM, using cutting-edge DNA technology, to helping people plant pollinator-friendly and bird-friendly gardens in our In the Zone program, to working with property owners on reducing road salt use in the GTA. There's something for everybody, and so I really invite you to check that out. So yeah, happy to take questions either now or if you think of something later today, or yeah, feel free to shoot me an email.
Thank you, Catherine, for that great talk. Just going to switch back here. There we go. Yes, we do have some time for some questions. And I mean, you covered so much information there on these assessments across the entire country and these different metrics of health and threats. And I think it's amazing. And also what's amazing is how you've made it at WWF Canada accessible to the public, through your website, which you mentioned there. And I'll just echo what you said. I encourage people to go to there and explore their own watershed and look at these issues that are facing them. I'm really happy too that you're coming out with these recommendations on how to act on some of these results, right? And is there some key things you would want to convey that, maybe if you have a science audience listening, what are some things that you would really like to see moving forward for the next round of reassessments?
Yeah, so for those working in the more science side of things, data sharing and open data makes a huge difference. I know it can be really tricky depending on their data ownership issues, and you don't want necessarily to share maybe data that you're going to publish something really cool with. So understandably, it's tricky, but it does I think make for more democratic understanding of our water resources, and it makes assessments like this one way easier and way more complete. That's one of the big things is we want to be able to share a very complete understanding of freshwater in Canada, and so the more data that we can include, the better it is.
That's right, and I'm happy to say that the River Institute does participate in your watershed report
Yep.
data donations as well. So we're happy to be part of that. Yeah, so thank you very much for your presentation, and that wraps up our session 1 of the morning. So thank you to all the presenters that presented this morning. I know a lot of effort goes into putting together presentations and taking the time to do that, and just to be here with us. So it's very appreciated. We have a lunch break now until 1 o'clock, when we'll return with our first guest speaker, Finn Donnelly from the Watershed Society of British Columbia. And that following that, we'll have 2 subsequent sessions with more very interesting speakers coming up. So I encourage everyone to join us again at 1 o'clock. And thank you again to all of our speakers this morning.